Okay, everyone, if you could take your seats, we're going to get underway. It's great to see everybody here this evening. It's wonderful that so many folks came out for the final session of the 2018 Fall Conference. For those of you who have participated before, you may remember that sometimes what we do in the last session is to have a more free-form conversation about a particular topic. You can almost infer what the topic is based on who is up here on the stage. And just very briefly, again, we're not standing on formality in this session. I mean, my colleagues and friends here are going to have very, very brief prepared remarks, 5-7 minutes, and then we're just going to launch into a conversation. Everyone here you already know. Adrian Vermeule, wonderful friend from Harvard University Law School. Phil Munoz, he teaches here at Notre Dame, runs the Tocqueville Center. Gladden teaches at Dallas, University of Dallas, and runs American Affairs magazine. And then Patrick Deneen, we just met him in the bar. I'm not exactly sure who he is. No, see, we're off to a good start. No, Patrick. Yeah, exactly. Patrick, of course, is a political theorist here at the University of Notre Dame, where we had the wonderful blessing of him coming to us from Georgetown. So, my friends here on the stage have been engaged in an interesting dialogue in various outlets, social media and different publications, about how to think about America and the American project from a Catholic perspective. And one of the things we're trying to model here at the Center for Ethics and Culture, and one of our hallmarks, is that we're a place where friends have friendly conversations and disagree. And we want to model for everybody else how friends can have difficult conversations and even have disagreements and in a loving way. One of the hallmarks of this, and I think you've observed this from our friends' interventions with one another in the public square and in academia, is that every time they characterize one another's arguments, it's recognizable. It's a recognizable version of their own argument, right? So that's a hallmark of civility and commitment to a dispassionate search for truth among friends. So what we're going to do is we're just going to hear briefly from, and again, the topic is Catholicism and the American Project. There are different proposals, there are different critiques, there are different sort of proposals or responses to those critiques. There are differences among everyone up here on the stage, but we're going to have a sort of family conversation, and it's a fitting occasion to do that at the University of Notre Dame, the Blessed Mother's University. So we're going to start with Patrick, and then Adrian is going to give his opening remarks, and then followed by Gladden, and then Phil is going to conclude with his, and that's not going to take very much time. And then we'll get into the freewheeling conversation where we'll join the issues with one another, and then of course the audience will be asked to participate as well. So, unless I've forgotten anything, is there anything else I need to say before we get underway? All right, great. So, Patrick, why don't we start with you?
Great. Well, first, thank you, Carter, the center, the staff. What an amazing occasion this is. It's the highlight, certainly the highlight of our year is this weekend. So I want to express my gratitude to the center, to David Solomon for getting this thing off the ground. In fact, I actually want to give a kind of a shout out to David in a particular way. And here in this spot, kind of in the spotlight right now, acknowledge in many ways that I'm here because of the center. And in particular, the first time I came to this conference, and I know some of you are experiencing this weekend perhaps for the first time and discovering how special this is. I had this experience in 2009, was my first time I came out here. This was the 10th anniversary of the center's conferences. The theme that year, not unlike the one this year, was the Summons of Freedom, was the 2009 conference theme. And I attended sessions, and I was struck by the camaraderie and intellectual and personal relationships and bonds of people. But it was one lecture in particular that I found absolutely riveting and in many ways life-changing. And there are a few lectures where you can say that that's the case. It was a lecture that was delivered by a former Notre Dame theology professor and a former CSC priest named Michael Baxter. And the title of that lecture, and those of you who may have been in the room that night will remember it, but those of you who don't may get some idea about his lecture by the title of the lecture. The title of the lecture was God, Notre Dame, country, in that order. He talked a bit about the sculpture above the east entrance of the basilica, where many of us were tonight. Of course, where it's carved into the portico, God, Country, Notre Dame. Talked a bit about the history of that, that its creator and booster, a military man, said that it represented the fusion of church and nation when it was erected. And Father Hesburgh, in fact, took that motto as his autobiography and in many ways his personal motto, saying that it had become his own personal trinity, was how he discussed it. What Michael Baxter expressed that night was what really drew me to Notre Dame. He said, Notre Dame, the core in many ways of its project since the time of its founding, was creating a kind of reconciliation and an identification between Catholicism and Americanism, that this has been the heart of what Notre Dame has been about since its founding. And it was this, in a sense, the description of what Notre Dame was doing that really attracted me here. And when the opportunity came for me to come here, I thought, what place would I rather be, even leaving Washington, D.C., than a place that had dedicated itself to this key question that I think we're all engaged in. Now, the difficulty that Notre Dame confronted, as many American Catholics did, was really kind of twofold, and they were related to each other. First, the long-standing Catholic condemnation of liberalism and even Americanism. Even the claim in Testem Benevolentiae Nostre in 1899, Pope Leo XIII's letter to Bishop Cardinal Gibbon, argued that Americanism was a heresy, and in particular, Americanism in the form of an emphasis upon individual conscience, an emphasis upon a kind of public indifference to faith, not just separation of church and state, but a kind of indifference to faith. And interestingly, that Americanism involved the effort to attract dissenters, even Catholic dissenters, by relaxing doctrine, relaxing kind of the teachings of the church. This was written in 1899. So you have that as one long-standing difficulty and challenge. And the second is, of course, the long-standing American hostility and suspicion toward Catholics. So on both sides, a kind of sort of armed camps, in a sense, regarding each other with a certain amount of suspicion. Now, what has Notre Dame's undertaking been? In the first sense, you can say that very early on, or for a long time, Notre Dame, part of its effort was to dismiss the idea that Americanism was a heresy. And one of Father Miscampbell's predecessors, Father Thomas McElroy, a historian here at Notre Dame, a CSC priest, wrote a book. Among his books was a book called The Great Crisis of American Catholic History, 1895 to 1900. So talking about those years that led up to his publication of this letter accusing Americanism of being a heresy. And in that book, McElroy made the case that Pope Leo was not, in fact, addressing the American situation. He was addressing the situation in France and the influence of, in particular, one American priest and convert, Isaac Hecker, over the French sort of Catholic views, and dismissed this Americanist heresy as what he called a phantom heresy, that it was not, in fact, descriptive of America. And in the end of that book, which was published in 1957, so note the year, he said, "May this study promote a union in Western Christendom in the present battle with the great atheist heresy of the age." It was communism. So it was a call for all people, all Christians, to see past what had separated them in order to fight the fight, a kind of call to fight against the heresy, in some ways, of communism. But Notre Dame's efforts, in some ways, didn't end there. In the first instance, you could say, not only were they combating the idea that Americanism was a heresy, they were also attempting to fight anti-Catholicism. And one of the preeminent ways of doing that is, clearly nobody here is actually interested in Notre Dame football, since they're actually playing right now. But one of the key ways that was done was, those of you who've been to a football game, and I assume many of you have, was at the beginning of every football game, not only would you have the national anthem, but you would have a recital of the second paragraph of the Declaration of the Independence and the preamble of the Constitution, which I don't even think they do this at the University of Texas. But we do it here, because on the radio broadcast, what America would hear was that this Catholic football team was more patriotic than even the University of Texas. But it wasn't only these efforts. I think there's another effort that's actually even more relevant to our discussion tonight, which is the effort in some ways to philosophically, politically, theologically, to render America and Americanism and Catholicism compatible. And the first of these efforts was in some ways to tell a story that America was actually founded as a Catholic country. And if you go to the main building and you look at those paintings on the wall of the main building, what you'll see is the Columbus's discovery of America. And this was part of that story, and that story was also about the founding of Maryland as essentially a Catholic state, the role of the Calverts and the Carroll family, Charles Carroll, who signed the Declaration of Independence, the only Catholic, and John Carroll, who founded Georgetown University and was the first bishop of America. However, this story had limited traction because it kind of really wasn't true. Catholics really didn't found America, so a kind of different tack was taken that really has a kind of very powerful presence here at Notre Dame. The first of these efforts was really an effort to basically say if it wasn't Catholic, even in its non-Catholic form, it was still fundamentally linked to a kind of pre-modern tradition. And one iteration of this was that our kind of founding fathers and the founding generation were actually really continuous with the pre-liberal tradition. And so that you could read and understand figures like John Locke as essentially continuous with sort of late medieval figures like Suarez and Bellarmine and other figures from that period. And some of my predecessors in political theory, Ed Gerner, for example, made some of these arguments. But there's another argument that one encounters that I've always found interesting, which is that the founders, were in fact basically liberal and even anti-Catholic. But unbeknownst to them, they founded a country that was in fact unconsciously Catholic or based on Catholic principles. This is what became known as building better than they knew. That in fact America wasn't founded on the explicit Lockean liberal grounds that the founders themselves claimed it was. And the first thinker to really make this argument was none other than Orestes Brownson, who's buried in the crypt below the basilica, and for whom a hall is named behind the main building. It was so important for Notre Dame to be associated with what was then the most famous Catholic convert, a friend of Ralph Waldo Emerson's, no less, that we had permission to exhume his body, transport him out here, and bury him in our crypt. It was so important for us to have that identification with this figure who developed this idea that the founders built better than they knew. And this is an argument that was repeated by John Courtney Murray and my very dear departed and much missed friend, Peter Lawler of Berry College. This has become these versions have become the kind of conservative way, if you want to put it, or the conservative liberal way for Catholics, conservative Catholics, in a sense, to tell the story of America's compatibility with Catholicism and Catholicism compatibility with America. On the left, you have an argument that Catholicism is compatible, particularly because of its social dimension, social justice and social services and so forth, and that real Catholicism is a kind of working in the world toward the ends of social justice. This is certainly the message that was always conveyed when I was at Georgetown University. You find it here as well, with an emphasis on a kind of non-judgmentalism, and instead a real kind of effort to advance what I think in the Protestant world would be called the sort of social gospel, and to advance this end. And this leads to a kind of diminution of doctrine, of sacraments, in favor of a kind of set of works. What I want to emphasize, though, is that these various approaches on the kind of, let's say, conservative liberal Catholic side and the progressive liberal Catholic side are both efforts to wed Catholicism and Americanism. And you see them both on display. If you spend more time, if you spend more time not here for this weekend, you'll see both of these on display here at Notre Dame. This is not the way it always is at Notre Dame. We have both wings, in a sense, flying here. But both of these have been engaged in the project of rendering Catholicism and Americanism compatible with two real consequences, and I'll end with these observations. First, this effort, particularly kind of from the right and the left, has really divided Catholicism in a profound and damaging way. We have right and left Catholicism, which fight interminably over what's the right way to understand Catholicism, but in which their division is really defined by their effort to render America and Catholicism compatible, simply from sort of burning from two sides of the candle. But I think arguably it's also, in some senses, diminished the faith, because it has tended to place politics as the central aspect by which we understand this relationship of America and Catholicism. And what's interesting is that later in life, toward the end of his life, Orestes Brownson actually changed his mind. What's interesting is that Notre Dame didn't read these letters that he wrote to Isaac Hecker. But one letter that he wrote to Isaac Hecker in 1870 was really quite revealing. I'm just going to read this and I'll stop. I quote, "Catholics, as well as others, imbibe the spirit of this country. They imbibe from infancy the spirit of independence, freedom from all restraint, unbounded license. So far are we from converting the country, we cannot hold our own. How many Catholics can you find born and brought up in this country that do not in reality hold the church to be higher than the people, or who do not consider her voice authoritative only when it coincides with that of the people? I think the church has never encountered a social and political order so hostile to her, and that the conversion of our republic will be a far greater victory than the conversion of the Roman Empire. I have hitherto wished to effect a harmony impracticable except by sacrificing the Catholic idea to the national."
Gladden is going to go now, and then Adrian.
So, thank you very much, Patrick. First of all, I just want to make clear that on this panel, I'm speaking solely for myself and not in an official capacity of any of my other affiliations. That was the laugh line. Second, a comment on the title of the panel. The panel is about Catholicism and the American project, and I think we should revise it at least to include Catholicism, the church, and the American project. The church is a community of believers united in the profession of the same faith, in the communion of the same sacraments, and subjected to the Pope. Speaking of the church and the American project, rather than just Catholicism, heightens the particular questions that I think are essential to address. For it is clear that the church itself is in the public eye lately and not in a good way. But we can and indeed have to grasp what the thing is, separate from the aspects that have drawn fierce and sometimes merited criticism. This is what our Lord and Sovereign Pontiff, Pope Francis, has in fact said in his criticism of the great accuser, a phrase met with some derision in American conservative communities, but fundamentally oriented toward distinguishing the church from its occupants. Now, even friends of the church these days have begun to foment potentially invasive inquiries well inside the church's jurisdictional boundaries. Jurisdictional boundaries? It's not a phrase often used by American commentators on ecclesiastical politics. Ecclesiastical politics? What's that? And on we go. The framing of the American project toward religion is explicitly not in a state-to-state manner. Rather, it is indeed as Catholicism, or in relation to Catholicism, this thing, or vague set of ideas and practices, somehow tied up with a deficient institutional apparatus, but fundamentally a set of ideas or practices to be married with other sets of ideas or practices. Yet it is in many other countries, as the scholastic phrase goes, quaedam communitas, a certain kind of community. Hence, many countries have agreements with this certain kind of community that take the legal form of concordats. It was therefore no surprise at all that American commentators were among the chief opponents, perhaps even the only opponents, of a state-to-state preliminary agreement between the Vatican and Beijing, as though the other alternative, that Beijing would suddenly declare religious liberty for all, were some sort of realistic option. This typically American problem that Catholicism is an ism among other isms, as though Catholicism and liberalism are two comparable isms, is manifest in American political thought, chiefly in the view that which Patrick was outlining toward the beginning of his paper, that Catholicism provides some sort of useful supplement to Americanism, that America's political liberalism is fundamentally sound, but needs the essential moral supplement provided by Catholicism. This is the view that Kevin Gallagher, in a widely discussed article, has termed Catholic fusionism. Social conservatism and free market capitalism can be easily combined. As Gallagher put it, Mid-century Catholics came to see the mid-century American political settlement as the very embodiment of Catholic social teaching. There was only one thing lacking, they thought, in the American social and political order. Modern Americans had lost the founders' sense of the natural law principles that could hold the republic together, principles that the Catholic tradition was ready to supply, end quote. The Gallagher thesis is, or commentary on this is as follows, quote, "The church has now completely lost this role. Although it continues to do charitable works on an immense scale and its bishops are never reticent on political questions, Catholics today, and especially young Catholics, live in a heightened tension with the world around them. In media, at law, in HR trainings, in advertisements, Catholic distance from mainstream culture is growing in a way that makes fusionist attempts merely to supplement American culture unrealistic," end quote. What I would suggest is that, in fact, Catholic fusionism always started off on the wrong foot. It viewed what was, even at the time, an already stylized America idyllically, and came to supply what it thought was a missing element. No one listened. Catholics should therefore simply flip their perspective. Instead of asking what Catholicism brings to America, in their Catholic capacity, they should simply ask, what is the church? After all, in the phrase, credo in unam sanctam catholicam et apostolicam ecclesiam, the belief set Catholicism includes the church. It's not a separable element. It is this movement to consider the church as such that has led to the surprising return of an essential aspect of Catholic teaching called integralism. Admittedly, this term, the revival of which belongs chiefly to Pater Edmund Waldstein, sounds of bishops wielding temporal swords in some sort of medieval black legend, but in fact it comports essentially with the topic of this conference. Higher powers is indeed a term from Solzhenitsyn, but as a paper title this afternoon reminded us, it is also from Romans 13:1. Let every soul be subject to higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The church has always made sense of this phrase with regard to the two powers, the temporal power and the spiritual power. As Pater Edmund frames it, integralism is considerably less complicated than it seems. First, it simply rejects the separation of politics from the end of human life, or in other words, the separation of the concerns of civil society and the state, which is essential to liberalism. Second, it asserts that the twofold end, temporal and spiritual, of life has two corresponding powers, the spiritual and temporal power. And third, it asserts that the spiritual power is to be superior to the temporal. This, I would suggest, is in observation, if not in application, not so far away from something I heard in Professor Dan Mahoney's excellent talk this morning, summarizing Solzhenitsyn. Statecraft is inevitably soulcraft. Oddly for conservatives, it is progressives who realized this most clearly in the 20th century and used the means of state to shape the sort of person the different forms of progressivism have aimed for. In my opinion, this is perfectly sensible. The practical observation to be drawn from these integralist observations is, I think, quite simple. First, political systems that distinguish and identify the spiritual power function much more smoothly than those that do not. In the United States, the spiritual power is nowhere identified. Therefore, it is nebulously everywhere, present in ways that cannot be resisted. In China, by contrast, they have the Central Guidance Commission on Building Spiritual Civilization, which makes us chuckle, but at least it can be identified and its actions clearly noted. Second thing to be drawn from these integralist observations is that many different propositions fit in what we might call this thesis one of integralism, the rejection of the separation of politics from the end of life, from the ends of human life. For example, it seems to me that propositions such as single-payer health care for non-everyday conditions, higher minimum wages, job guarantee programs, and postal banking are all, at some elementary level, integralist. After all, Catholic social teaching on totally practical matters flourished at the same time, the time of Rerum Novarum, that these propositions were made clear in the modern, not the medieval world. On many of these points, many on the left have an essential contribution to make that the American Catholic right has taken no account of. Yet American Catholic conservatives, present company accepted, of course, continue to take an approach that makes their accusations of integralism's impracticality difficult to believe. The point of shifting one's vantage point to the church isn't necessarily to find an immediately actionable program, but to understand political dynamics and adjust to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Carter. I just want to start by thanking Carter for having me here. It's my first time at this conference, and it is spectacular. It's a wonderful, wonderful event. I'll speak very briefly on three different questions. The first is why I think integralism, I think you heard Gladden define it, is desirable as an ideal in America. And I want to flesh out here a bit Patrick's discussion of Leo's views, Leo XIII's views on America by saying that Testem Benevolentiae Nostrae in 1899, although very important, is actually just a kind of secondary negative corollary of a positive vision that's laid out in a great document, Longinque Oceanae, from 1895. And what makes Longinque great is the sweep of its vision. It offers a providential account of the church in America, emphasizing that the church in America predates the formation of the United States, that it spreads in the Americas through bringing the inhabitants of the New World into the right relationship with the society of the church. For Leo, the church's telos and aim in America is not just conversions at an individual level. It's to bring the polity on the American continent into the right relationship with the church, understood as a perfect society and as a teacher of the temporal power. So that's the context in which Leo specifically addresses the question whether an ideal for Catholics is a permanent reconciliation of the church to the American version of separation of church and state. And Leo says that that's not acceptable. He says it would be very erroneous to draw the conclusion that in America it would be lawful or expedient for state and church to be dissevered and divorced. Rather, he says the highest state of the church's flourishing would be enjoyed if, in addition to liberty, she enjoyed the favor of the laws and the patronage of the public authority. And then a few years later in Testem, Leo draws some negative corollaries in terms that I think resonate very much today. He criticizes what he calls the lovers of novelty. And he says they make two mistakes. One is they give unwarranted importance to the natural virtues. So they think that the natural virtues are sufficient in themselves for a right ordering of the polity, overlooking in Leo's view the need for grace to perfect fallen nature through the sacramental economy of the church. That's one great mistake of the lovers of novelty. The other great mistake is they praise civil freedom, which Leo says is now the foundation of almost every secular state. But Leo continues, in the apostolic documents addressed by us to the whole church, we have set forth at length the difference existing between the church as a divine society and all other social human organizations, which depend simply on free will and choice of men. So the difference between the church and other social organizations is that other social organizations are voluntaristic. In that sense, they're liberal. The church is not that, and it's a fundamental mistake to treat the church as just another organization, voluntary club, existing in harmony with other such organizations. So Leo's here incorporating the great documents like Immortale Dei and De Eternum Illud, by which he teaches this Catholic integralism, and I'm convinced by arguments by people like John Joy and others that this teaching is not reformable. And I think that we don't have much choice but to take integralism as an aim, at least as a political ideal. Now, we know from other contexts that temporary accommodation with non-ideal regimes is sometimes necessary. This is Leo's relationship to France in Au milieu des sollicitudes. But it's never a cause for celebration. That is, we mustn't confuse the necessity for temporary accommodation was something to be celebrated. Here we have to distinguish short-run and long-run issues about political possibility and feasibility. I think for Catholics in America in the short run, which might of course mean decades in political time, I think Catholics in America will exist in the sort of decaying liberal regime of the sort that Patrick has convincingly portrayed. The problem about this liberal regime is it becomes ever more anxious and dangerous as it senses its own weakness and lashes out dangerously against dissenters. This, in my view, is the pattern of persecution in the late Roman Empire, and it's the pattern of persecution that we have begun to see today. So what's the best defensive approach in a regime of this sort? In my view, the best defensive approach in this short-run period is to populate the governing councils and courts of the regime to try to steer it away from wickedness. Our claim to do that will be both sheer force of competence and bonds of various kinds with non-Catholics. In these matters, my inspiration is a very great handbook of survival tactics for creative minorities in a hostile regime. That handbook of survival tactics is called the Old Testament. And a lot of it is devoted to the question how creative minorities can survive and even flourish in hostile political circumstances. So I think here of Jacob, Daniel, Mordecai, and Esther in all their different ways. Now, in the longer run, I think we are duty-bound to hope and attempt to fulfill Leo's mandate. How that might happen is obscure, but I think it's a mistake to demand a kind of specific blueprint for any movement that seeks change on this sort of scale. Every such movement stumbles along under severe uncertainty and has to remain alert for opportunities. I draw one major lesson from what I've seen in my lifetime of the permanent sexual revolution, from sudden sweeping political change like 1989, or even the sweep of populism around the globe in recent years. The lesson I draw is that political constraints that seem ironclad at a given time are actually extremely malleable and fluid. I think the proponents of the permanent sexual revolution have understood extremely well that public views are surprisingly malleable to influence by groups, even small, dedicated groups, that find ways of addressing and moving public opinion. So I think it's a mistake to be prisoners of our time-bound preconceptions about which political constraints are fixed and which are not. Finally, let me say a word about what exactly is the alternative if it's true that we live in a decaying and somewhat increasingly dangerous liberal regime. Well, one alternative I've heard in various versions is some kind of communitarian alternative in differently specified versions. I don't think this is wrong exactly. I just think it can't be the whole solution. That is that well-ordered local communities need to be protected by a great city, if you like, by a kind of Rome that ensures their peace and flourishing. Why do I think that? I want to mention as a specific example a community in Bayview, Michigan, which has recently been sued in federal court. Well, why was it sued? It's sued for being an intentional local Christian community that tried to use law to solidify its position against the influx of what people have called liquid modernity. So in Bayview, Michigan, for decades only Christians were allowed to actually own cottages and act as voting members of the community. They have been sued by a group of plaintiffs who the plaintiffs say they are repeating the crusades of the civil rights era. So here's the main plaintiff. He says, "We feel very much like the crusaders in civil rights litigation in the South, or women's rights issues. Over time, you just keep pushing to see that equality emerges. Pushing, of course, with the coercive aid of the liberal state through its courts. Now, of course, this doesn't always happen. The Amish are still around for now. But the point is that liberalism tries to dissolve all local communities into the pure voluntarism that it thinks is the model and pattern of its own life. Liberalism will knock down any barriers against modernity that people try to erect. And that power doesn't need to be actually exercised to constitute a form of dominion. If I learn anything from Philip Pettit, it's that the potential for power is power. That is, the threat of the exercise of power is domination. Like the sword of Damocles, the mere threat dominates those subject to it. In that world, the existence of local, voluntaristic, solidaristic communities, Catholic communities, is always at the sufferance of the liberal regime. And I think that's a kind of half existence that's not what we're promised and not what we should hope for. So in my view, the only way forward is to try to give Catholics a voice within the institutions of the liberal order, eventually to supplant it. Thank you.
Philip.
If you don't mind, I'm going to stand. Thank you.
Typical liberal.
I want to start by thanking Carter. I don't think Carter actually gets the recognition he deserves for what he does at Notre Dame and what he does for the pro-life movement, especially. So thank you, Carter. I mean, I will say, if I knew Professor Deneen, so I was the search committee chair that hired Professor Deneen. If I knew he came because of the center, I would let you pay for him. So, I want to also thank my friend, Professor Vermeule, Professor Papin, for joining us, and of course, Professor Deneen. I have tremendous respect for these gentlemen. They're so interesting, even if they don't understand America. I've been debating what to title my remarks. I think I'm going to change it. My original title was Why My Catholic Friends Don't. Building Better Than My Catholic Friends Understand. But I think I'm changing it now to Father Bill, we have 3 winners. I've been both excited and nervous for tonight. Excited because 3 great Catholic intellectuals and scholars. I mean, usually I debate one-on-one, but it's fine. And then when Carter asked me to be a part of this, despite this like lovey-dovey introduction he just sold it to you, he actually, I should get the email, he says, I want to have a Catholic steel cage match.
That doesn't
Carter,
sound like me.
Carter's a bit like Trump. You never know whether to take him figuratively or literally. I had actually sent Margaret, I wanted to enter from the back with Eye of the Tiger playing. I'm not kidding about that. Okay, I'm gonna do 3 things in these supposed 7 minutes I've been given. Okay, first, you'll see I'm going to take a different tack than my friends. I'm going to try to identify the essence of the American project. Second, I'll introduce a few themes about Catholicism's role in America. And to be honest, I'm not really going to talk about Catholicism in particular. What I say about Catholicism, I think, holds for Christianity more generally, certainly Protestantism and Judaism. It's not limited to Christianity. So I'll be talking more about religion in the American project. And then thirdly, I'm going to try to do this in the allotted time, and I hope, I mean, this is probably impossible, I'm I'm going to do this in such a manner that Adrian does not block me on Twitter. I've been poking him the last several days. We'll see how far you go. Okay, so what's the essence of the American project? America is an experiment. The experiment is this. Can we build a political community based on the principle of equality, dedicated to securing liberty, and in which the people live lives of virtue? So equality, liberty, and virtue. Start with equality. The fundamental principle of the American political project is the idea that all men are created equal, that no individual possesses, by nature, political authority over another. In Jefferson's words, this is his letter to Roger Waitman at the end of his life, that the mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their back, nor a favored few, booted and spurred, ready to ride them legitimately by the grace of God. We have to remember that equality is a claim about political authority. I also think we have to recognize, and this is in some ways to respond to what Patrick said, equality rejects the classical teaching that wisdom as such is a legitimate claim to rule politically. Of course, you want those who rule to have wisdom, but that they're wise alone, or that they say they're wise, doesn't give them a claim to rule. Even the wise must rule via the consent of the governed. Consent follows equality. If you reject the principle of consent and government by consent, you necessarily reject the principle of equality. Okay. Equality, the political principle of equality, I think we also have to recognizes, rejects the claim that religious authority itself is a legitimate claim to exercise political rule. And of course, equality rejects the idea that a particular class of individuals has legitimate authority to rule on account of birth or wealth or nobility. Okay, that's the essence of equality. Okay, liberty. Now, the American project is a varied thing. So let me talk about the liberty as understood by our founding fathers. The American founding fathers understood the purpose of the political community is to secure liberty. The authority of the state, they therefore taught, is limited. For our purposes this evening, perhaps the most important limit is the state's authority over religion. The state has no legitimate authority to use the force of law to coerce what the state holds to be true worship, or to punish what political authorities consider to be false worship. The politics of liberty is a necessarily limited politics. Okay, so why are we equal? Why ought politics be limited to securing liberty? And I think actually Christianity, including Catholicism, helps us answer these questions. All men are created equal because that's how God created us. God created us as free and rational beings. He made us the equal human beings that we are by giving us the nature that we have. Why ought our politics be limited at securing liberty? Well, ultimately, we limit politics because we are to love and worship God in freedom. America's politics of liberty does not reject religious authority or religious truth. It's quite the opposite. It recognizes our obligations to God are of higher dignity and higher authority than our obligations to the state, and therefore the state must be limited. James Madison in the Memorial and Remonstrance says, "We have rights among men because we have duties to God." We limit the state's authority because of the legitimate domain of religious authority, and because individuals have been created to love God and to worship God freely according to their conscience. Okay, what about virtue? If our politics aims at virtue, or if our politics aims at liberty, how will citizens become virtuous? And this is why liberalism, broadly conceived, is an experiment. The liberal question is whether free people can maintain sufficient virtue not only to preserve their freedom, but to deserve their freedom. The experiment will likely fail if the people don't maintain their faith. So Christianity and Catholicism in particular, but the Judeo-Christian tradition more generally, makes limited government possible by fostering the moral virtues. This is why Tocqueville said that religion ought to be considered the first of America's political institutions. Religion allows us and teaches us how to use our freedom well. So while religion is outside of the political sphere, it animates our politics. The founders understood this. They understood the necessity of virtue and the necessity of religion to cultivate the virtues. George Washington, in his farewell address, this is his advice to the people, including us. Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of the religious principle. The founders understood the necessity of religion and the necessity of virtue. So it's religion, including, of course, Catholicism, that informs and makes possible the American political project. Religion explains, gives an account of our foundational principle of human equality. Religion makes the politics of liberty possible. And ultimately, religion accounts for why a political regime of liberty is good. Because the ultimate aim of a liberal polity, including our polity properly understood, is to foster the conditions that allow us for the free and true worship of our Creator. Thank you.
So we've had a lot of, thank you for those very rich opening remarks. So it's interesting. I mean, it seems like everybody agrees that there's a problem, right? I mean, everybody agrees that there's a problem in contemporary America, a problem of alienation, a problem of exploitation, and so on. And, as well, I think everybody will also agree that under at least certain regimes, there is a kind of aggressive secularism that seeks to drive religious people from the public square. And so everybody agrees with that, right? Does everybody agree with that? Phil, you agree with that? Yeah. So what seems to me, there is some disagreement, as I hear it, about the roots of the problem. Patrick, of course, wrote a wonderful book about pointing to liberalism as the fundamental culprit, both, and I'll quote you here, Patrick, you said that there are two issues with respect to liberalism that lead to the pathologies that we're talking about. One is a premise of anthropological individualism and voluntaristic conception of choice, and human separation from and opposition to nature, right? So is that a fair characterization of you? I mean,
you quoted me?
That's a direct quote. Yeah, I'm a lawyer, so.
So well written.
And I think it was very beautifully written and edited by whomever your editor is. So, just kidding. Gladden, do you and Adrian agree with that? Do you agree that liberalism, as Patrick articulates it, is the principal culprit in the pathologies that we all agree exist? Or do you have some?
Broadly.
Broadly. That's good enough for this conversation. Is that short?
Yes, I broadly agree with Patrick's diagnosis. I think it's a wonderful portrayal of a decaying regime. I might disagree with his particular accounts of the nature and roots of liberalism, right. But as sociology of the regime, it's beautiful.
Yeah, and Patrick, or sorry, Phil, I get them confused. Do you disagree with that diagnosis? Is that correct? Or the roots of the
I agree that not all is well.
We've already agreed that everything's bad. The question is, do you agree with Patrick's diagnosis? And I think the answer is no, right?
Not on the causes of our problems.
That's what I mean. Yeah. And how would you, and your argument, and you sketched it out just a moment ago, is that what Patrick is describing is not actually rightly understood the core of the founders' vision for the United States, right?
Yeah.
And you said that there is a conception of virtue, and I think you said it here, and you've said it elsewhere, that natural law is an important element of what was driving the founders' vision, and that, in fact, is part of the. Now, but in some ways, what you were just talking about, though, seemed to be like a procedural framework within which virtue could arise. Is that fair? I mean, that is to say, there's.
Well, not exactly. I mean, yes and no. I mean. a limited regime, you can foster virtue in various ways, right? You can compel it. I mean, whether you can compel virtue is an interesting question, but so you can habituate it, right? Or you can step away so the institutions of the family and non-governmental institutions can cultivate virtue. Right? And so, I mean, I'm going to jump ahead, but I see so clearly. I mean, we can just decide things right here and then go watch the second half. I understand the difference between Adrian and I, right? I want to push the state back to its proper limits. Adrian, and I think Gladden too, just want to take it over.
Well, no, but so let me just say though that I'll let them speak for themselves. No, you use the word religion. You keep saying religion is useful, religion and Colloquy, whereas Gladden and Adrian and Patrick hasn't weighed in on this specifically. They're talking about the church, right? Gladden, I mean, your entire framework flows, does it not, from your conception of what the church is and what authority it commands and what our response to it should be. Is that fair?
Right. Religion is a particular state of life within the church. But I mean, the problem with the term religion is that it's indeterminate to, or it's insufficient to describing what each of the, communities which are classified under the name religion understand themselves to be. It's probably even insufficient to understand how, little congregational churches and highly integralist townships in early American New England considered it themselves as well.
So, it seems like one major point of disagreement is a disagreement about authority, right? I mean, would you agree? I mean, could you say a little bit about actually, I'll ask Adrian to please respond to Patrick's comment, which seemed to suggest that individual freedom and autonomy and consent are sources of authority. You can't impose coercively authority in the way, especially according to a substantive regime like the church. Is that a fair characterization of what you said? Adrian, Gladden and Adrian and Patrick as well, what do you guys think about that argument? Let's start with Adrian.
I am going to answer the question, but I'm going to answer it in the form of posing a question to Phil.
Okay.
If that makes any sense.
Sure.
Because when Phil says, he says the end of the liberal polity is to foster the conditions that allow for the free and true worship of God. My question is that a falsifiable empirical hypothesis or prediction, or is it some sort of analytic claim? If it's a falsifiable empirical hypothesis, my feeling is that it's been spectacularly falsified by the course of American history, indisputably so. That the effect of the liberal polity has been to dissolve and hamper and undermine, at least in the long run, a fully integrated in the sense of integrity worship of God. And what we're left with is a social club with some strange rituals to it that doesn't fully express the relationship between God and man's communal life that we were promised.
Yeah, so I guess the response to that would be to point, so Gladden points to the, we should be more like the progressives. I mean, they understand politics. Like church, they understand Pope Leo the 13th, the progressives do, right? We ought to aim for a comprehensive politics. And the progressives got this. Well, the progressives have, in one way or the other, been ruling this country for almost 100 years. And so I'd actually turn it back. What has corrupted the church? Is it the limited politics of the founding? Or think of the periods of corruption, right? The South, which did not embrace the principles of the founding, right? A very corrupt, an oligarchic, corrupt regime, pre-Civil War South. That was a comprehensive politics. Or the progressive politics of the last 100 years. What Gladden is calling for us, to what extent is that actually responsible? Has superseded, displaced the church, right? So I think the question, it's a good question, but we might disagree on actually what has been parasitic on the church, right? Well, it's not clear to me that it's the original principles which have not been governing the country, but rather a more comprehensive vision of the political community that's antithetical to the church.
Yeah, jump in.
Phil, is an essential part of the experiment, as you described it, that the liberal system would also be robust against determined minorities with a substantive vision of the good, attempting to turn it in their favor?
No,
because it would,
no, exactly, no. I mean, a limited polity would have its limited reach, right? It allows minorities to flourish. I mean, numerical minorities to flourish.
I was just kind of trying to drive back to the original question of maybe that Adrian had suggested that what's the time limit on the experiment by which we know that the sort of idealized goal of having a limited politics with a virtuous polity, succeeds and is robust to challengers. Because it seems that an essential part of your narrative is also that this whole system has also been lost because of the progressives.
Well, look, I mean, these are enormously complicated questions, right? I mean, so are things as bad as you say? Well, in some sense, yes, I agree. In some sense, no. I mean, look at where we are right now. This is all possible because a liberal regime, right? There are all sorts of good things that flourish in a liberal regime, and I think it's easy to criticize that, right? But the fact, at least for now, that tomorrow morning or tonight, that we'll all go to our places of worship, or not be forced to go to a place to worship, is a great human good. Right? And that's not true everywhere, and that's certainly, in the course of human history, how often and for how long a period has that been true, where people could worship according to conscience? And America has stood for that, and that is a great human achievement.
Patrick, why don't you jump in here? What's your reaction to the line of conversation that's unfolding right now?
Well, I guess what's striking to me is, I think Philip's absolutely right. This was an experiment, and it was unprecedented. And I will give great respect and acknowledgement to our founding fathers for a vision of what a decent polity they hoped would look like. But I think, like any experiment, well, maybe unlike any experiment, there's no way to know in advance how it's going to turn out. But based on the conditions in which they lived, I think they had sort of every confidence, because they could see a people that, obviously there were terrible injustices, the existence of slavery, but yet they could see a people that they believed, as Washington, as Adams expressed, that had some reservoirs of virtue. I think, however, the problem, and here's where Philip and I would diverge, is that in some ways they believed that the persistence of these virtues would be sufficient to sort of populate this thin, emptied understanding of what politics and, broadly speaking, sort of society and economy and so forth would be. And couldn't foresee, in the ways that I think we can now see in hindsight, that the very sort of, in some ways, realization and adoption, and indeed internalization of this thin conception of what the purpose and ends of human life was, which was really the pursuit of pleasures, the emphasis upon individual rights, the expansion. While the state is limited, it nevertheless expands in order to afford us with these experiences of liberty. So it's limited in its ends, but it's not limited in providing us with its means. In other words, that the realization of the very philosophy that they believed would be sufficient, it turns out, ultimately undermined the very virtues that they, with good reason, assumed would persist. And so I think it's necessary for us at this point, and by us I mean probably largely people of faith, but also people of discernment and coming from other directions, to acknowledge that this experiment has probably not gone well. And I think it's simply, in a lot of ways, wishful thinking, and frankly a bit of willful conclusion to say it's just because the progressives came along. I think there's as I argue in my book, there's ultimately a very deep connection, and indeed a kind of logical unfolding, you could say, within liberalism itself, from which progressivism finds a very natural home in in the regime that was established in America, right? I mean, why is it that you want to talk about 100 years? It's only roughly 80 years after the founding that progressivism really begins to arise. So if it was such a good and solid and in many ways perfect founding, why was it so profoundly susceptible to this kind of foreign contagion? I don't think it's simply just kind of this this virus that was dropped into our laps. It developed in many ways naturally out of, in particular, the belief in the capacity of the human will to shape the world in our own image, which goes from being an individual project now to a kind of social project. But in some senses, they're no different. So I want to, in some ways, emphasis that I think, and I'm coming at this from political science, and we're sort of at least sometimes we're an empirical science. Let's look at the evidence, and that's why I concluded with that quote from what I see as a very prophetic quote by Orestes Brownson, who worried absolutely, and indeed I think presciently, about what he saw as the course of liberal democracy in America. We have the right and the freedom to go to church. You're absolutely right about that. But it turns out that church attendance is collapsing, and religiosity is collapsing. So we have that formal right, but in some senses, what good is it, ultimately, if we cease to be that religious and virtuous people that was presumed, but the experiment suggests no longer actually exists?
So that's a nice segue into ask Patrick why, in your book, it's an extraordinary diagnosis, and then at the end, though, when the question is posed, well, what do we do about this? You don't seem to want to join the vision that Adrian and Gladden are articulating. Why is that? What stops you from joining the project that they're advocating?
Well, they're kind of crazy.
Was it?
What did he say?
He said
Just
crazy.
yeah.
You know what else is crazy? Eating the flesh and blood of our Lord.
That is crazy. Yeah. Give me that good old-fashioned religion. Yeah.
Carter, may I ask
No, what's
the
right-
question to be clarified in one way?
Sure, go ahead.
I would love to hear Patrick address not only whether he thinks integralism is politically possible or feasible in the United States, but whether he thinks it's a first best ideal. That is, if there were no constraints, if Protestantism weren't the iron constraint he takes it to be, would he want an integrated polity? Yeah.
I think I ultimately differ from all three of you.
Yeah.
In the sense that I think that the first order question is not the relationship of church and state. I think it's our relationship to church. I think it's being the church. In other words, I don't think there's any political solution that we could conceive of that makes the church at home in the world. And what worries me about both Philip and Gladden and Adrian is that in some ways I think they're both trying to make an argument for how the church can be at home in the world. I suppose this puts me in the more Augustinian camp, but I actually think, Adrian, you sort of framed it that integralism is in some ways what we're, I forget how you said it, but in some ways entitled to, or what we're in some ways should be our birthright in some sense. I don't remember exactly how you put it. No, yeah. But I actually think in some ways our birthright is to be the pilgrim church on earth. And in some ways, at some level, resist the notion that our project is to make ourselves at home in the world. And so this is why, in the end of the book, I actually I don't think it's the first order business to propose what is the ideal form in which the church is in the world. That's always going to be a kind of prudential question. I think we would agree on that. There's first order and second order. In many ways, I think our condition is less looking at the 13th century and more looking at the first century. In this sense, that town in Michigan, maybe their mistake is trying to do this through politics and not live as a kind of Christian community with a willingness to say that in this new Rome, we are likely to be very much a kind of in opposition to the state, and the state is going to respond accordingly. But that's not our concern, ultimately, because it doesn't touch the heart of what the church is.
Gladden?
I think I agree with Patrick's broad reformulation of the question that that for Christians, particularly members of the church, there's a question of the primary question is their relationship to the church. I would only say that the consequent question to that is what is the juridical authority of the church over its members? Yeah. I mean, this has been kind of broadly the project of Tom Pink over the last few years, and he has this beautiful image, or he describes the image. He talks about the image of the bishop's crozier, and the fact that anyone, let's say in the first century, who would have seen the image of the bishop carrying a crozier or have heard of this image would realize that the bishop's crozier is a highly coercive form of authority, and so I wonder somewhat whether when we've been talking about coercion thus far, whether we've sort of underspecified what types of coercion we mean and what we don't. I mean, it's sort of typical, I think, in American context. Now I'm going on a bit of a jag, but it's sort of typical in American context to think of immunity to coercion in matters of faith to mean to be sort of fully demonstrated by the fact that the act of belief cannot be directly coerced by some direct application of physical force. Tom Pink points out that through most of ecclesiastical history and therefore political history as well, coercion has had a much broader sense. I mean, we talk about, Phil says none of us feels coerced in matters of faith or we worship according to conscience. I mean, do we feel that we shop according to conscience? That's another thing that we do that just expresses our choice. And yet we all know, ever since the birth of advertising science in the 30s, that there are all sorts of ways to sort of lightly and indirectly, manage and manipulate us, which we experience on a daily basis. And so I think you could actually say that back in the bad old days when, churches, not just the Catholic Church obviously, made some things accessible to their members and took other things away and presented them with some things and hid other things from them. Those are all things that the church considered to be coercive authority, and none of those were ever considered to be, incompatible with faith. So I just think we have to answer the question, if we are discussing the church, it's not sufficient to say that the church isn't at home in the world. We have to address what sort of coercive authority it does have.
I just want to add one, I agree with all of that. I want to add one fillip to it, which is my view, and I don't know anyone who holds the view that it's either desirable or possible to return to the 13th century. I think what is true is that I hope to recover certain principles and certain outlooks that I think we've lost that would help us to understand our situation. And if the 13th century is the place to look for those principles and outlooks, then terrific. And one of the main ones, following on what Gladden said, is an account of consent and of the will and its relationship to the church that makes space for the idea of a vow, and the idea of a vow being central to how we structure our lives. So a lot of times when we think about consent in a liberal framework, we think, at this moment now I want to do X, someone is preventing me from doing X, and my will is being constrained. I think a different, older conception is that we can be held to vows we make, because when we are held to vows we make, it's actually an expression of the highest consent, and an expression of our highest freedom. And this is why the marriage vow, the baptismal vow, either made by ourselves or by our parents on our behalf, is so fundamental to pre-modern regimes. And that seems to me a richer, more plausible conception of freedom than, in many ways, the liberal one. And it's extremely revealing that the place in which liberal society allows us preeminently to be held to prior promises is commercial contracting, right? Because that is what's necessary for the system to go.
Yeah. Also, in some jurisdictions, advanced directives for end-of-life decision-making.
Yeah, there you
can
go.
bind yourself. You can pre-commit yourself to something that you can't change your mind about if you lose mental competence.
Doesn't that suggest, though, that within a liberal society we could take vows seriously as they are? That it's actually not contrary to the principles of the regime to actually uphold vows?
Well, principles of contract aren't inherently liberal, but liberalism has dissolved some
But taking
contracts.
freedom seriously, a politics dedicated to liberty takes our freedom to make vows seriously, and if those have been, seriously with consent, you can hold people to their consent. That's perfectly compatible in a liberal regime.
As a historian,
right? No-fault divorce is not a necessary consequence. This is to push back on Patrick. No-fault divorce is not a necessary consequence of the Declaration of Independence. Right? I mean, that's the argument, and that's just not true, right? There are certain tendencies. I mean, Patrick is onto something. Every regime has certain tendencies.
Right.
And a liberal regime will have the tendency to force freedom, be excessively free. I mean, so every regime has to be mitigated against, right? And I think Patrick is very good. But the failure then is not in the regime principles, it's in our understanding of them and of their tendencies, and therefore to combat them. I mean, think of what the progressives did, right? The solution to democracy is more democracy. That's exactly wrong, right? That's why we had the Constitution we had. And it's not just the progressives, right? I mean, the progressives are a product of a rejection of the idea of natural law and with it natural rights. That really starts intellectually in the Darwinian Revolution, right? World War I, World War II, the collapse of mainline Protestantism, right? The sexual revolution, all these things explain where we are. And you can't just blame that on, on the principles of the Declaration of Independence. I mean, history is real, and you have to counteract both the tendencies of the regime and what happens in that regime. And we failed miserably in so many ways. And I think that accounts for where we are today.
Just a quick clarifying question. Phil, are you suggesting that a liberal regime could potentially pass laws enforcing religious vows?
Enforcing what?
Religious
vows.
Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, I mean, if they're given in such a way that civil jurisdiction is I mean, that's a difficult one because
I was just
could you enforce? Well, look, part of marriage, right, is could you? That's too fraught with complications because there's some things the state could not enforce, right? I think. I mean.
Okay. Well, it's just that that was the substance of Adrian's suggestion.
Could you enforce commitments that are made within the jurisdiction of the state? Yes. Could you not have no-fault divorce? Yes.
So let me ask a quick question before we've approached this from a variety of angles. Maybe just one quick question. This is to Gladden and Adrian. So Adrian, I'm intrigued by, as a lawyer, as a person who's worked in the government, I'm intrigued by the idea, and I know you're a lawyer too. And did you ever work you worked in the clerk? Do you work in the government?
I did not.
No,
Yeah.
okay. Anyway, it's pretty good. Just kidding.
I was
going to say, that's exactly, I'm talking about the concept of strategic flexibility.
Yeah.
I like to think of this for Godfather 2 fans as the Hyman Roth option, which is to say, Michael, all we need is the money and a young man that wants to run for president who understands business. We're bigger than U.S. Steel. Like that's Hyman Roth's wonderful comment in Cuba when they. So I'm actually very sympathetic to the idea of people with the right judgment getting. I mean, this is in some ways an obvious point to achieving positions of authority and influence in a governmental framework. Is there disagreement between the two of you really on any point? But specifically on the question that I'm raising is
why are you both up here?
No. It's a serious question about the how to get from here to where the destination that you're proposing. You're talking about a kind of incremental, sort of a short-term strategy of drawing upon the Old Testament examples that you use in various writings to become not a dishonest broker, not somebody who is dishonest about their loyalties, about what they really believe, but to give good, loyal advice to the principal as the agent, but when you have an opportunity to do so, to make choices and to give advice that conform to the truth, right? Gladden, do you subscribe to the similar kind of, what one could say, a kind of incrementalist strategy, or do you have a different pathway forward?
First of all, Adrian and I strongly disagree in the matter of liturgy. So
That's not what we're talking about right
I know, but
Don't
you did say or really anything.
Yeah,
so
I meant
just
within
wanna,
the confines of this conversation,
no,
the four corners of this conversation.
it would quickly shift to a death match.
Yeah, we're not doing that. We're not doing liturgy. Maybe next year.
On questions of liturgy. No, I mean, I think I've been just trying to articulate a kind of intellectual project more than anything, at least in the comments tonight. And one of those would be to sort of demystify some aspects of integralism, which is not a system that I invented or that I ever thought of myself as belonging to before reading it, reading about it, and then thinking, and then sort of latching onto the fact that I think it's kind of descriptively true of human agents in general. So it's at least the kind of first level of kind of first observation of integralism is that people act according to some vision of the good and act in that way politically as well. And I think, with respect to sort of actors in government positions, I think that it's only various forms of liberalism or liberal ideology that prevent them from acting in such a way.
Okay, so we are obviously way over time. But I just want to take a moment to reflect on what we just did here. What we did was have people who are friends, people who like each other, people who enjoy each other's company, people who, well, Patrick, nobody really likes Patrick very much, but not even Inga likes Patrick. So I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this in this forum. It's probably embarrassing to say it was being videotaped and streamed. Anyway, no, but the point is I just want to say that this is what we're supposed to be doing, friends. We're supposed to be having conversations amongst ourselves, people who are all committed to the same vision of
not the same vision.
Well, no. At the deepest level, I think I hope we would agree. But maybe not. So in any event, I want to thank our speakers for being generous with their time and with it. Please let's recognize our speakers. We're gonna have an opportunity to continue our conversation in the atrium. So this is not the end of the conversation. This is the end of the formal program. But I do have to thank some people here who made this entire event possible. So again, the closing reception's in there. We have some of our widely coveted CEC t-shirts available for you. And then a reminder, tonight's daylight savings time, so set your clocks back an hour and get an extra hour of sleep. So here's, just very briefly, let me just say, we have to thank and recognize the entire McKenna Hall and Morris Inn staff for welcoming us so warmly this year after year, particularly Eric Francis and Lisa Vervinkt. Let's give them a big round of applause. This is McKenna Hall. This is actually the last time this conference or any conference will be, well, any conference of ours will be in this space. McKenna Hall is going to be torn down next summer and will rise again from the ashes like a mighty phoenix in the summer of 2021. However, next year, please put it on your calendars, November 7th through 9, 2019, our 20th anniversary conference. We hope to see all of you there. But some other people we need to thank, Kristen Garvin Podell and the Institute for Scholarship in Liberal Arts for helping us coordinate conference logistics. All of our wonderful speakers and guests, many of whom have traveled from far and wide to join us here in fellowship this weekend. To Ignat Solzhenitsyn, who is now left for the airport, we are so honored and grateful that he was able to share his time with us, and we hope it'll be the first of many visits to Notre Dame in the future. Our Soren Fellows and students, particularly those who volunteered this week to help the conference run so smoothly. Our benefactors, the members of our board, Maureen Ferguson, Kathy Geschwind, Father John Paul Kimes, member of the Executive Advisory Committee, as well as our Raymond of Pennyfork Canon Law Fellow and Miser Fellow. He has like 15 different titles at the Center for Ethics and Culture. Thanks to all of those wonderful people. And let me just finally say, our staff, the CEC staff. The CE staff is excellence enfleshed. Their incandescent, extraordinary, amazing talent and commitment will ruin you, as I've said many times before, for all other staffs that you ever encounter in this life or the next. Laura. Laura Gonziorek, our Associate Director, Tracy Westlake, our Administrative Assistant, Ken Hellenius, our Communications Specialist, Pete Lopsy, who runs our Student Formation Program, Petra Farrell, who runs our Culture of Life programming, and most of all, for purposes of this weekend, Margaret Cabanis, the most extraordinary, amazing, fantastic human being. We don't deserve Margaret Cabanis. We don't deserve her, but we're glad that we have her. So we'd like to thank you all for coming. Let's continue our conversation in the atrium. God bless all of you, and we'll see you next year.